I am open, and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. There is hurting in my family. There is sorrow in my town. There is panic all across the nation. There is wailing the whole world round. I am open, I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who've gone before us. So lift me up to the light of change. Well, that's the beginning, the first verse and chorus of I Am Willing by Holly Near. And I'm Ted Williams, and this is An Island of Vision. Welcome to this podcast. I recorded the musical introduction for this episode last weekend, 2 days before George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. It's interesting to me how I could sense that some big changes were happening, and it's certainly true that huge changes have happened now. The streets are on fire with racial riots and anger and frustration, the likes we haven't seen since the late 60s. I remember growing up outside of Detroit, in the suburbs of Detroit, and watching and feeling the incredible pain. And those pains have not been healed. I heard this evening a quote from Martin Luther King that riot is the voice of people who are being unheard. I didn't quote that quite correctly, but it certainly makes sense to me. So I've decided to title this episode Unraveling the World, Reflections on Indigenous Perspectives and Dinosaurs. So why do I call that Unraveling the World? That's certainly because, I guess it's obvious, things are unraveling. Centuries and centuries of a system is not working. It's not being able to be held together any longer. It's so far out of balance. And this affects all of us. So I'm going to look at this certainly from a systems perspective, but I've been wanting to also talk about my experience working for several decades with an Indigenous people and how Indigenous perspectives have affected my thinking. So I'll get to that in a moment. And dinosaurs. Shortly before the 2016 presidential election, Michael Moore gave a rally that was recorded and presented in his film Michael Moore in Trumpland. And one thing that really jumped out at me is he said that Donald Trump and what he represents, and I think it's much more than that, a whole system, are dinosaurs. And their time has passed. But that doesn't mean they're not going to give up without a huge fight. And we're seeing that now. So I'm planning to get into that topic a little bit. And I'm sure this is going to seem rambling. And that's just the way it is. So for months I've been thinking about how I can feel, and I know many people are sensitive to this, can feel, not just see and hear, but feel deeply inside the incredible tensions, pain, and anguish with a world that is falling apart and it doesn't know where it's going. And so many people, maybe all of us, are deeply uncomfortable with that uncertainty. You know, what will it mean for us in our personal lives? What will it mean economically? What will it mean to those we love, whether we know them or not? For example, one thing that's become really clear with over 100,000 people in this country that have been identified as having died from COVID-19, and there's probably way more, it disproportionately hits black and brown people, indigenous people, poor people. It hits the people who have not been supported in living liberty and justice for all, as the Pledge of Allegiance says. And they know it, and this whole situation is highlighting it so strongly. So I want to talk about that from a systems perspective, and how the riots and the incredible pain that people are feeling and expressing concerning the murder of George Floyd, how that all ties together. And I'll weave in my perspectives on indigenous views and complex systems. So one thing I've been struck by is how people talk about when we get back to normal, or maybe a little bit softer saying when we get to the new normal. Well, there's not going to be a normal or a new normal. We're in a state of disintegration of the current system, and those who benefit from the current system are going to fight tooth and nail to maintain their power. And that isn't just about Republicans, it's about Democrats, and I'm an unabashed Bernie Sanders supporter and a progressive view, but that's not my whole view. And hopefully I'll describe some of the views that I have that all connects with. One of the reasons it's taken me many weeks to record a new podcast is something a friend of mine said. She said that there's optimism in my podcast. And when she said that, I realized, oh, I didn't know what to say that would be optimistic. I was feeling such pain, and have been, about the world situation, that it would be hard to describe that from an optimistic perspective. So I now have a little bit more energy to say something. One of the reasons that I have decided to record this episode is that my child, my 12-year-old, did a school project and actually took a great risk and wrote a song and presented it as part of a project. And that gave me a little bit of a little more courage to push myself. So that's part of where I am right now. And I'm going to end this episode hopefully on somewhat of an upbeat note. I need to, for myself, so I can draw energy and sustenance from that, because really deep down I do have optimism, but I'm definitely going to wade into some very deep pessimism as I walk through this. So I want to reflect on what's happening concerning riots and rallies and a lot of anger concerning the death of George Floyd. And I'm going to look at this from a complex system perspective. I'm reminded of when I was studying family systems that many times a couple will come, they'll send their teenager who's acting out to therapy. And my older brother was certainly that person. And a wise systems therapist, family systems therapist, may see that the parents have some unresolved work. And rather than work with that acting out teenager, the black sheep or whatever you call that person, that the parents resolve, work through their process, and seemingly magically, the teenager suddenly stops acting out. And what that tells me is, in a system, and it doesn't matter whether it's 3 people in a family, or whether it's a town, or a country, or the whole planet, and perhaps in non-human systems this would apply too, but I'm thinking human systems particularly. So people who are poor, people who are black and have centuries of unresolved mistreatment from slavery, from not receiving what they were owed after slavery. So they are the vulnerable part of the population. And with COVID-19, which has stressed poor communities, black, brown, indigenous communities, more than more affluent communities, predominantly white communities, that tension has grown, and the murder of George Floyd was a breaking point. And even if individual police officers are all charged and even convicted, that's not going to solve the problem, because, and many people know this, but it does have to be addressed. There has to be accountability on the individual level and on the level of systems such as the Minneapolis Police Department, etc., and other police departments. But these are much deeper issues that go back decades and centuries, and they, of course, predate even the United States in terms of the kind of paradigms that are currently enacted in our country, where you have a small group of people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, who hold the power structure. So that system is becoming more and more illuminated, and those people are certainly going to fight to keep that, keep their power. One of the things I want to talk about somewhat in terms of complex systems is different worldviews and what motivates different worldviews. And so this is part of integral theory or spiral dynamics theory. And in that, in the United States, for example, particularly, and Europe, the quote first world nations, you basically have three different worldviews that are all kind of intermixing, and they have different values and different motivations. There's traditional group of people, and traditional are often evangelical, religious groups, Mormon communities. So I'm not just looking at religion when I talk about that. I'm talking about social structures that have a strong internal social structure and a great deal of compassion for the people in that group. They have a morality, they have a sense of cohesion. They're very status quo in terms of maintaining what they see as the right path. Those who are outside of that or have different opinions are the other and are not considered as highly, or plain considered wrong, or could even be considered not fully human. And I would say the natural world is part of that other, and resource extraction and the use or dominion, as the Bible says, over the natural world is part of that worldview. Then you have the rational or scientific worldview, and that worldview, there's kind of two different segments to that I think about that are very powerful in the United States. Those have to do with capitalism, accumulation of wealth and power, and a whole series of principles about what is considered to be the best thing for having a good society. The theories of economics and banks and corporations and that whole system. And within that worldview, maybe a different aspect of that worldview has a more scientific perspective and focuses on a rational truth, truth from a given perspective, perhaps more Newtonian kind of what can we sense as true that is reproducible, measurable, using our five senses. Those two different aspects, you might call them coming out of the Enlightenment 500 and some years ago in Europe. The ones that are more capitalistic focused tend to be more conservative leaning, and those who are more scientific focused tend to be more liberal leaning in political views. And then there's the more recently developed group, really kind of flourished in the 1960s and beyond, and that's more of a diversity, pluralistic view, tends to see different cultures and perspectives as being valued. So those are kind of the three different worldviews that are contending, and actually there are large and small scale wars going on, and the polarities between all of those is getting greater and greater as time goes by. During the Trump presidency, these things have been really highlighted. So Trump doesn't particularly fit in any of those. He is what's considered egoic in his development, which is more typical of a 7-year-old, a natural developmental stage. I heard him supposed quote that he hasn't changed since he's 7. Maybe that's absolutely true. In the egoic stage, truth really doesn't matter. What matters is ego gratification. And there really is nothing other than me and not me that needs to be managed for the value of me. So when people say, and I certainly say this, that he's not a compassionate person, I don't think it's part of how he is structured. It's not evil. It's simply not part of who he is. So, and what's interesting in this whole system of looking at development is that egoic part is part of all of us. When I think about Buddhist practice, the ego is considered, something to transcend. And as I've thought about it and practiced, my spiritual practice is more and more, I sense that the ego is a vital part of who we are. The problem is that it is given free rein, and Donald Trump is a poster child for this. And I think he has done a tremendous job of illuminating that part that exists in all of us. All of us have the potential for this. In Buddhist psychology, called the Abhidharma, in my understanding, and what Thich Nhat Hanh has taught and written about, is that we all have seeds that are wholesome and seeds that are unwholesome. And the ones that we water are the ones that grow. And this certainly fits in with brain development theory. The neural networks that are reinforced get stronger, and those that are not become weaker and may actually fall apart. And some of these ideas are valuable in treating trauma. So, coming back to George Floyd and what's going on in terms of a system, this war between these different worldviews, there's a worldview that wants to hold on to the way the world used to be. The world that used to have slaves, the world in which women had much more of a set role. And even, I would contend, the more progressives have some very set and rigid ideas because we're all human. We all have egos. We all get scared by change unless we are the Buddha or Christ or an enlightened being that can move with those changes because we can see more deeply. And I'll come back to that also in looking at the more optimistic sides. So I want to jump into what I think has been totally overlooked in the integral theory and in the spiral dynamics, which were developed by white Euro-American sociologists, as far as I understand, at least looking at it from my experience with indigenous peoples. It is a wholly different way of looking at the world. As a matter of fact, in that system, the tribal development stage is below the ego development. It is before, it's infantile, it's it's below. In my experience, and I acknowledge my bias, traditional indigenous systems, worldviews, and perspectives are actually quite beyond the worldviews of the Euro-American mainstream system. Systems of knowledge like science are embraced within a much larger context. I hear people who are very progressive, who see human beings as separate from nature. And I think that's a really false way of seeing things. They see human beings as the destroyer. Well, they're the destroyer, and this again is my views from an indigenous perspective. And I should have given this disclaimer at the beginning. I am not a spokesperson for indigenous people. I have been influenced by and have my own perspectives and may quote people who I respect a great deal, but I am not indigenous. I do not claim to stand in the shoes of indigenous peoples, but I have a great deal of respect for those views, and I believe they have a great deal to teach those of us who don't understand yet those perspectives. So I'm going to say some of the hallmarks of those that I think are very important. So rather than being below an egoic level, being below traditional level or any of the mainstream levels of development, different paradigms, I think indigenous perspectives are much more all-embracing. They see humans as truly part of the natural world, and in many ways a child, immature, compared to the much more evolved peoples like the fish people and deer people and wolf people. They have developed way beyond us. Their ability to live in the world is so much more advanced. Perhaps we're just an experiment, and that's what evolution does. But the arrogance of Euro-American societies is certainly part of what's brought us to the brink of destruction and may have already taken us too far. So I am humbled in the face of indigenous views. And I did want to mention a little bit of my specific experience with Indigenous peoples. I was somehow drawn to Indigenous worldviews over 50 years ago. As a teenager, I remember reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and I couldn't even get through it. That sense of how could people be treated so poorly, seen as something inferior to be destroyed. And through my 20s, I lived in Arizona and traveled in Mexico and interacted with Indigenous peoples quite a bit, and traveled to Hopi Land and to the Pueblos in New Mexico and the Dinos people, met Native people along the way. Then nearly 25 years ago, I began working at Northwest Indian College as an instructor, and up until a year ago, I worked there. I had been the academic dean and acting vice president, and worked a great deal with the Indigenous people, the Coast Salish people, who owned the college, and supported their vision. And from my perspective, I was let go, fired, because of standing with the Indigenous peoples. So be it. There I am in this point in my life, but my heart is still there. So, some really important things about Indigenous perspectives. Leroy Little Bear is a Blackfoot man from Canada whom I respect a great deal. When I worked at Northwest Indian College, he came many times. I have worked with him in other situations, being part of a language of spirit, dialogues, and he's a wonderful purveyor of communicator to non-native people about Blackfoot and other Indigenous perspectives. He's very clear. He speaks from his tradition, not from any others. But many of the key points are very much similar. And another person is Gregory Kahete, a friend who I worked with, and he wrote a book called Native Science. And I'll put some links to talks and this information in the text for this podcast episode. So one thing that both of them and other Indigenous scholars speak about is that whereas Western science and Western perspectives are about measurability and truth and facts in the physical world, in Indigenous science and Indigenous perspectives, the key piece, the key connector is relationship. And what has struck me working with some of my friends in the Indigenous community is a term, relational accountability. And to me, relational accountability, if I consider myself, but this is true for everyone and everything, everything's in relationship. And I am accountable to all the ancestors, to the natural world. And, I consider my 12-year-old child and consider generations and generations into the future. I'm accountable to them. I'm accountable to the world. That sense, I think I touched the surface of it, because there have been times I have been privileged to attend Indigenous ceremonies, and I can feel that relational accountability go through my body, through my whole being, my soul. And I realize that, there's that part of me that that knows that. And I don't think our society, mainstream Euro-American society, is conscious of it. But it is part of who we are. It's part of everyone. And the fact that we haven't embraced that, it's not in most of our consciousnesses, is part of why we are so out of balance. And when I think about relational accountability, I also think about balance. And systems are about balance. And I don't mean a rigid balance, because all living systems are dynamic. They are constantly changing. In Buddhism, impermanence. Leroy Little Bear talks about the flux, and that everything is in constant change. Another Buddhist principle that I very much appreciate comes from the Prajna Paramita, which is the wisdom in Sanskrit, the wisdom of perfect understanding, part of the Heart Sutra. Heart meaning central or core in French. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And that has so much meaning far beyond what I comprehend. But in this moment, what I can express that it does mean is that out of the flux, out of the wholeness of everything, every individual particle, every person, every electron, every city, every country emerges, form, and it dissolves back into the flux, into the emptiness. Means lacking an individual separable self. There is no separation. It's not that form doesn't exist. It's not that birth and death don't exist, but they exist in a much bigger context. As my sister talks about interconnectedness, and how some of the people she talks to don't have any sense of what that could possibly mean. So that leads me to think how we are such an immature society. I think indigenous peoples are not perfect. Their cultures are not perfect, but they are much older, and I think are much more developed. And we are at a point in the world right now where we can change. So this leads me to an ending where I want to talk about kind of two different possibilities. And those possibilities, well, let me tell you about this book that it's a children's book. And for the first half of the book, you go through the story. Oh, it's about these mice traveling on a raft to a distant land. And then the pages split, and you have the top pages, the top of each page and the bottom of each page. And they show two possible futures. And in one of them, it's the negative future. And it's the future of division. It's the future of attempts to accumulate power. And it leads to a horrible outcome. And then the other is the path of, I suppose, awakening. A deep sense of knowing that there is a unity, and it's not skipping over the steps of development. We all have to go through individually, and as society, we have to go through our own developmental steps. I am nowhere near an evolved person, but I have some perspectives, and I have a deep desire to grow in that. There's been a lot of focus in, I'd say, both the spiritual communities and maybe the more progressive communities about self-compassion, and the recognition that there's a lot of self-hatred, and that then gets acted out on others. And this ties in with trauma, how those who are traumatized tend to pass on that trauma and pass on violence. And so there has to be healing. There has to be a process of opening to a deeper a shadow work, that is, those parts of ourselves, shadows being those parts of ourselves, individually or collectively, that are not conscious. So back to George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd, and what's happening is that so many people are not really conscious of the depth of racism, the depth of inequality in the country. And that's one level of what's going on. And I contend that there's much deeper levels, what I would, for me, are spiritual levels. I'm reminded of some spiritual teachers from the past, Khalil Gibran, who saw that, those polarities are, we need all of those. They are part of our reality, and if you try to throw out any parts of them, it won't work, because that's just not the way reality is structured. And I'm remembering a quote from from Rumi from hundreds of years ago, and it goes something like this: out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field, I'll meet you there. And Coleman Banks was a translator who used the word field. And I really like that sense of there is a place beyond our conscious awareness. And I think a lot of our spiritual practices are about that. And there are different levels, like social justice is a level within the practical world, like Bernie Sanders' movement, not me, us, is pointing in that direction. And it's going to take steps, and it's probably going to take a lot of grief for us to get there. So back to some reflections on indigenous perspectives. What's happening in the world is, I think, totally understandable and predictable. One of my previous podcasts was Nature Bats Last, and I think that's exactly what's happening. The system of nature, bigger and bigger, the whole earth, the cosmos. Relational accountability, I believe, is the law, not an idea, not just a good thought. It's a law, just like gravity is a physical law. Electromagnetic forces are physical laws. Those run the universe. And I believe when we understand more deeply those relational accountability laws, then we can restore balance. We can know our rightful place within the system. And it's constantly changing as we grow and change, but we can know our place in that dance. So, where would I like to go from here? Oh, this was something that Leroy Little Bear brought up in a talk that he gave earlier this week. And, as someone trained in astronomy and physics and computer science, he said that he differentiated between science and technology. Science is engaging new ideas. It's going into the unknown. And technology is using the known to create things. And technology is very powerful. It's what's given us computers and your ability to hear this podcast. And he mentioned it's been decades since any real new science has occurred. And some people may disagree with that. But I think that what that strikes in my mind, what his words strike in my mind, is that most science is still in a very old paradigm which does not take into account the inner world. It does not take into account the spiritual world. It does not take into account relational accountability. So it's hit a wall. And so this is where the future, my optimism and pessimism lie. I think that, first of all, as I mentioned in the title of this podcast, dinosaurs, and how right now our society, mainstream Euro-American society, much of the world society, is a dinosaur. Its time is over. Its time is over because the environment has changed. We are much more connected, both because of technology and because there is, and I can't substantiate this from a scientific perspective, but I'll state it anyway. People like Carolyn Mace have talked about this, Marianne Williamson, many others, that since the 1940s, with the advent of the nuclear age, slowly our consciousness collectively is shifting, and there is an awakening happening. Now, whether that happens quickly enough or not to avert the fact that our technology has far outstripped our ability to manage ourselves, That's hard to know. This may be heretical, but Donald Trump may actually be very helpful in this respect by highlighting the disease in our culture and pushing on it so strongly, getting rid of environmental regulations, getting rid of protections of vulnerable peoples, really pushing the systems, and those who benefit from those systems are in a tough place. Whether this whole thing, like a metaphor I've used before, it's like a brittle stick, whether it will crack and snap, which will disassemble as systems do. They break apart into smaller pieces. They're organized a certain way. They break apart into smaller pieces and then reorganize at a higher level. So, for example, simple molecules will break apart under certain conditions, and this has been seen with experiments using lightning and heat to take simple molecules, and they will form into more complex molecules to make amino acids, which then are the building blocks of DNA and RNA, the building blocks of life. And those structures then become more and more and more complex. And each time there's increases in complexity, it's not just a smooth, gentle change. There's a breaking apart and a reassembly. So evolution is messy, as Jeff Salzman, who does a podcast called The Daily Evolver and is an integral follower, speaker, he likes to say that. And it certainly is true. You know, when mammals evolved, it became the dominant life form, and dinosaurs faded away. Huge numbers of species died away. Huge numbers of species are dying now, and human beings may be those part of that. Human beings have the capacity to kill themselves now, and how they haven't done it thus far is an amazing miracle. I wanted to mention also, before I look at the final kind of optimistic view, is that I've noticed that nature seems to be very happy with the lockdown. I don't know if it's because they sense a slowing down of human society, but I see a lot more wild animals. They come closer. I just had a deer walk in front of me about 3 feet, just sauntered along across the trail. Rabbits are out more. I hear the sound of birds seem different. And what's really interesting is other people are independently saying the same kind of things. So I don't know exactly what the reason is. I believe nature and animals sense that there is a shift happening. So take that as you wish. So here's where I'm going to go with my more optimistic thought, that we are at a choice point. Every one of it individually has a choice point. Do we face our demons? Do we face the fact that our society does not work any longer? Do we face that, or does the choice get forced upon us? And it's an interesting paradoxical choice, I believe, and this is part of my spirituality, that it's a surrendering type of choice, the ability and willingness to move as the conditions change, to listen to a deeper voice that guides us because it's there available for all of us. But if you're not, don't believe that's true, you may discount that voice. So I'm going to end this podcast, this very long podcast, with a song that I wrote over 30 years ago called Where the Wind Blows. And this is a recording from the singing group that I used to be part of. We disbanded about 8 years ago after being together over 12 years, called Equinox. And it was on our first CD. So I leave you with a little sense of my optimism and the hope of that kind of choiceless choice, the paradoxical choice to surrender to the flow. I wish you all well until we meet again.
Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow it home. You never hear a leaf saying, I just want to stay here. Or another leaf whining, I want to blow the other way. Where the wind blows, the leaves will go wherever it may flow. And where the wind carries them is where they're meant to go. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow it home. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow it home. I sit here in my lonely room, looking at what I've lost, wondering if I'll ever get back the loving that it's cost. But as I watch the unfolding my life is going through, I know within my deepest heart the wind blows through me too. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow it home. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow it home. People are always asking for things that are not near. We get just what we need if we let that wind blow clear. And if we let our spirits soar the way they want to go. Remember where the wind dies down, in the springtime we will grow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the wind blows, the leaves will follow. Where the